Hello, WCA. Mike Amori, Week 3 update. You're looking at a position that I kind of just made up, which is very similar to the workouts on chesskid.com. Over there, if you play with an extra bishop, they will have all 8 pawns for white, all 8 pawns for black. And again, I highly recommend that you guys do these things. Here, I made it 3-on-3 to make it a little more realistic and also to give you a tougher workout. Now, inside this position, there are a couple of ideas that are hiding that you may not see from the start. But these are things that you've learned at other WCA classes or with your coaches that are very important to know as you try to win this position. For example, here, if this bishop were an extra queen, then one way to win would be to trade all of the pawns equally and just do a queen and king checkmate. That would also be true if you had an extra rook. But here, my friends, that obviously is not the case. If you trade all the pawns and you have one minor piece, the game will be a draw. So you already know that part of the technique to winning this position does not include trading all the pawns. Okay, let me show you a couple of things that are hiding inside the position that are well worth knowing as you see how I played the computer here. Okay, here, this doesn't look anything like what was just on the board a minute ago, but there is a pawn wedge visible here, and I want to just review quickly the ways to play against these wedges. Now, if it's white to play, white's turn in this position, if they play king c4 and take opposition, then they will win this black pawn by force. Now, these little wedges have this cool thing called a wing. So if you think of this wedge as the body of an aeroplane, just imagine the 3 squares to the immediate right or left of that pawn. If your king can land on one of those squares, he can win the pawn. And of course, that does not include when black is already attacking your pawn. But in this position, as soon as you take opposition, you'll see that, let's go back a second. When I take opposition, you see those squares light up again? Every time you're the one that takes opposition, this king has to give you at least one of these squares. If he comes to this square here, you should see which one is open. So let's just keep the highlights on the squares that are on our side of the board. Now, black has to move. So assuming he doesn't want to give the pawn away too easily, he's going to move and protect it. Now, let's jump on the wing. And you'll see by force that you can work your way in. And there's more than one way to do this, but basically just get to some position like this. And you'll see that after king d6, black will lose the pawn. Question, and this is not easy. When black moves the king, can white win the game? If you need to pause the video, you can do that. But the answer is, I don't know, you're pausing now, so technically you can't even hear me because the video's paused. So I just took a sip of tea. The answer is no, it's a draw. All black has to do is back the king up, and when white does take the pawn, simply take opposition. And no matter how hard white tries, you can try to guess black's moves. You just defend by putting your king in front of the other king. If you would like, I can turn the board around. Isn't that amazing how I do that so quickly? I never drop a piece. And this is what it looks like when you're defending. If the pawn moves, you just keep your king in front and then make sure that the white king cannot get ahead of that pawn. Just take opposition, they give a check, back you go. Stalemate, right? Okay, let's reflip and let's go back to the original position with all the highlights. Let's back up a move. What if it were black's move in this position? If black took opposition in this case, it would be white who would have to eventually let black onto the wing. They would take opposition again, and as you can see, black will get in. But I have the same question for you. This time I don't have to turn the board around. Black can win the pawn, but can they win the game? Answer is no. Same exact idea. You see how the black king is working his way toward the pawn? Nothing white can do about that. Eventually, you'll get some position like this. Just let him take the pawn on this rank, because when they do and you take opposition, the game will end in a draw. Now, you might ask, why did I show this position with the pawn wedge when we're trying to win the one I first showed you? Let's go back to that. So from this position, when you push these pawns up the board, there's going to come a time when there will be a pawn wedge created. Occasionally, what you can do is maybe sacrifice the bishop for a pawn that leaves you with a winning king and pawn ending. But if you don't know how to use that wedge trick, you won't be able to win that extra pawn. That might make more sense when I show you how I played against the computer. There's one more trick I want to show you. Okay, it's this one. And this is another problem that's hiding in the original position. If you trade all the pawns and leave yourself with this position, black is not only down a bishop, but they're down a pawn. This specific example is a draw. So as you're learning more theory at 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock, this one you definitely want to keep in the memory bank. With the king and pawn, this pawn here being a rook pawn, you can start to advance the pawn. The problem is the bishop will never get the black king out of the corner. So he'll just kind of hang out in that area, and eventually he'll go back and forth between g8, where he is now, and h8. And the problem for white is going to be how to make progress. You can make a move with the bishop just to waste time or get black to move, but he's going to shuttle back and forth. You can give him a check, and he goes back, and hopefully here you can see the problem, having the bishop the wrong color of the queening square. If it's in the middle of the board, it doesn't matter what color the queening square is. The bishop can squeeze the king out, but because he's in the corner, there's always this darn stalemate trick. So again, wasting time with your bishop, the king will just slide over, and if you get frustrated and finally give a check, he'll go into the corner, and no matter what you do, stalemate is coming, or you're just going to give white that pawn, black that pawn rather, and the game is a draw. Okay, now let's go back to the original position. Now let's see how we go about beating a computer from this position. If you remember the last video, when you have extra material, the first thing you do is make sure your opponent can't do something to you. Well, in this case, they only have 3 pawns at the top of the board, and they're a million miles away from becoming queens. So in terms of losing this game, that would be really hard to do as white. So when you have that extra piece, all I did here was I brought it into the game, and I attacked this pawn up here. They protected it by g6, and it's funny, I almost thought about sacrificing the bishop for 1 pawn, because I think there's a way to sneak a win out 3 against 2 in that position, but that would be really tricky and not worth the headache. So what to do? Start getting the king into the game. Black played f5, and now all of these dark squares open up for our king. So I've played first h4, which slows this pawn down, and we're trying to keep these guys locked on light squares until we can get our king up and into the game. So black started to centralize their king, and now f4. This puts a total lock on the g5 square. It also creates a pawn wedge here. So if this pawn ever moves or gets traded, then I can think about getting my king to the wing and winning. Do you guys see how that's come into play? The only other thing I need to worry about is making sure that I don't let these 3 pawns get traded and these 2, leaving me with only that pawn. That would not be good, but we're going to avoid that. Black put the king up. So what to do? Again, you can always pause the video and just guess what would you do. So here I just brought my king up, and I'm going to try to sneak this king and maybe park him on this square. And if I can get my king here, then I always have the possibility of sacrificing this bishop for this pawn. And if my king is here, when they take back, I'll get 2 pawns for the bishop, leaving me with a 3-on-1, which is totally winning. Okay, so black backs up, and I just go about my business. King d4. I want to park my king here. Black doesn't like that, so they keep me out. So what's the next best idea? Come to d5. You see the little dance the kings are doing around this wedge? Hopefully you learned something from watching the first part of the video. So king e7, and now king e5. And that's it. King comes to f7. If he comes to d7, by the way, I want to show you a little idea. Bishop to c4 kind of cuts the king off on these lines, and if he comes here, sorry, that's a new variation, we can always play this cute little trick of putting the bishop on that square, which is going to make these pawns move. And the second this king has to move, you'll see that this square is covered, this square obviously is covered, 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 covered. The king is going to have to back up. Okay, do you see that little trick? You put the bishop right in front of your king. Now, if these were the only 3 pieces left, or if black only had a king, and you did this at the top of the board, it would be stalemate. Okay, just a little pattern. So let's go back here. The black king decided to hang around his pawns. Seems like a good idea. And now a check. And as soon as the check was played, the king goes to e7. And guess what? You see the trick? Bishop e6. And now the black king is either going to back up, or we're going to get one of these pawns to move. Now, this guy here can't move. If this one moves, remember we have that little lock on the g5 square. So black decided to play h6. And now, what to do? Remember the sacrifice idea? Why not? Does it work here? Calculate a little bit. Bishop takes, pawn takes, king takes. Looks like a win to me. It's going to be 3-on-1. Bishop took, pawn took, and then h5. A little in-between move. Why h5? Because it creates a wedge. And that wedge is going to be a problem for black as soon as white lands on the wing to take the pawn. And if you remember the other positions, there were times when this black king could take opposition and keep you out. Anytime that happens, we always have a pawn down here that can move once and force the black king away. So that's why in this position, let me back up for you, I can always take this pawn. And it's completely winning, but I just decided to create the wedge, there it is, knowing that whatever black does, I'm taking this pawn in the next move. So he played f7, I take the pawn with opposition, king went to g7, I could just jump on the wing and come over, but I decided to play g4, king h7, king f6, king g8, and that's it, my friends. Just king g6. Game is over. Some of you may wonder, let's go back to, say, this position. When you take the pawn and they play king g7, why did I bother with g4? I could actually just play like this and work my way toward that pawn. It wins just as easily. No matter what black does, you know, let's say here, you can just come here, up, and here, and you're going to win the pawn for free, which is just as easy as any other variation. Okay? Get the bishop in the game. Remember this little trick of putting the bishop between your king? Game is over. All right? Go to chesskid.com and do your own workouts there. The more you do this, you'll develop your own technique and you'll become really good at chess. I'll see you birds in class.